So I'm delighted to welcome Eve Krakowski, who is showing one of the advantages of our frustrating situation of not having been able to meet in person, which is that we get to have marvelous people from all over the world in a virtual way. So, and Eve is really wonderful speaker for this group because she has brought us a set of sources that to some people are really well known and to many of us really are not very well known, and has, I think, created a bridge for medieval studies as a wider subject to get into understanding medieval Egypt through the lens of the Cairo Geniza. Eve has done a book on coming of age in medieval Egypt, on women's adolescence and Jewish law, which has generated a lot of buzz and been, I think, interesting to people who work on things other than Jewish medieval women in Egypt, but, you know, because of using the sources that she has available to do all sorts of kind of things that the rest of us are feeling very envious about. So without too much further chat, I'm going to hand over to Eve and let her have the floor. Before I do, though, I want to just remind everybody that the protocol is Alice has got the chat closed during the talk, but then when Eve is done, for the remainder of our time, the chat will be open. And indeed, we're going to ask you to direct your questions through the chat rather than using the famous yellow hands, because it will make it a lot easier for me to understand who is, you know, who's next up, as it were. You have the opportunity to either write your question into the chat if you want to, or to just write question, you know, and I will then call on you in, you know, as you appear on the list. So, and I think it has, there has been sometimes a tradition of people also throwing things into the chat, which I think is, you know, permitted. You can use the chat as you want, but during the actual paper, we're going to close it down so that, you know, we can just all really focus on Eve and hear the same thing. So with that, I will hand over to our speaker. Thank you so much, Eve, for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored and excited to be talking to this group. I wish we were in person, but I suppose it's much less likely that I'd be speaking if we were, so I guess it's all good. So I'm going to share my screen and start talking, and you should just let me know if you can see my slides. Yes. Is that good? Yeah. Okay, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to start with a document, but I'll then back up and explain what this stuff is. In the mid-11th century, Natan ben Abraham, who was one of the leaders of the Palestinian Gaonic Yeshiva in Jerusalem, wrote a letter to console a friend. And we don't know who the recipient was. His name doesn't appear, but he most likely lived in Egypt. And the letter was written after this person's relative had died. And I have translated just a little snippet of the letter here. How I must hasten and not delay to address the grief that has hit you suddenly. My heart cries out for your sorrow till my mind is numb and my sense is destroyed. I can't describe how this thing has shaken me. I went on my way confused and destroyed like a wanted man until I recovered myself from the drunkenness, and I think he means the drunkenness of his emotions, not literal drunkenness, if not the afflictions, and returned to the Creator. May he be exalted, thankful, and steadfast. Like the saying, which comes from Leviticus, and Aaron was silent, which is what it says after Aaron's two sons are suddenly killed by God. Our first one said to us, peace be upon them. This is referring to the late ancient rabbis, justify God in his judgment. So this is one of many thousands of letters that survived in the Cairo Geniza, which is the primary source base that I work with and which I will just give a brief introduction to. Although I'm sure many of you know the Geniza already. The Geniza is a massive collection of medieval manuscript fragments and pieces of everyday writing that endured by chance inside a synagogue in Fustat. What you're seeing on the slide is the sort of reconstructed Ottoman era interior of the synagogue. But the documents and manuscripts that came out of this repository are much older. Altogether, this is Fustat, which at the time was a kind of sister city to Cairo. It was Egypt's first Islamic capital. It has now been subsumed into Cairo proper. The Geniza Papers overall mainly contain fragments of literary manuscripts, which are incredibly important in their own right. But I work with what's called the documentary Geniza, which is a collection of, we think, maybe about 40,000 everyday papers. So things like commercial and personal letters, state and communal petitions, and correspondence, meaning between communal leaders and between state officials, legal documents and court records, and many, many business and communal accounts and lists, which have actually been understudied to date. Most of this material is in Arabic. The core deposit comes from Fatiman and Ayyubid, Egypt and Syria. So the sort of densest concentration is from Fustat itself, where the synagogue was, but we actually have material from much further afield, kind of at the fringes of the Geniza corpus, so to speak, much further east and much further west. Most of it is in Arabic, but not in, we do have quite a lot of Arabic script Arabic as well, but the core material is, the mass of the material is in Judeo-Arabic, which is basically the vernacular Arabic of the day written in Hebrew script. And there's also Hebrew, Aramaic, and actually innumerable other languages represented in the corpus. But the stuff I'm going to be talking about today is mainly either in Hebrew or in Judeo-Arabic. So when Alice invited me to give a talk to the group, I wrote her that I was writing a book on legal formulary and that I was also starting to work on a brand new project about death. And we agreed that death is probably a more interesting subject in general to hear about than legal formulary. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really, really new. It's sort of a brand new project that I have just started to work on and to gather material about. In a way, it's great to be presenting here so that I can get feedback from people in other fields like before I start doing the bulk of my research. The end goal is to write some kind of social history of responses to death in medieval Egypt using both the Geniza and other material from the region. The reason that I want to do this is that the subject is fascinating and that the Geniza documents offer an incredible wealth of evidence for it, which has really barely been looked at. So what I'm hoping to do today is just give you a sense, like a taste of some of this material and some of the things that I'm hoping to do with it. The starting point that I started with when I started gathering material is the last treatment of this subject, which appears in S.T. Goitein's A Mediterranean Society. Goitein is kind of the founding father of writing social history using Geniza documents, and he wrote this incredible 5-volume work, which you can think of as a kind of extremely enjoyable and readable, like annotated bibliography of documents almost. He just goes through many, many, many documents and talks about them and draws conclusions from them on kind of every possible subject that you can think of. But there's an entire library of books waiting to be written out of Goitein's 15-page treatments of subjects. And one of them is this topic that he calls Living with the Dead, which appears in volume 5. I had originally thought that Goitein borrowed this title from Patrick Geary's classic study of saints and relics in medieval France. But then I realized that actually, no, he wrote it before Geary's book came out. And then I eventually realized that the phrase living with the dead was super popular among anthropologists in the 70s and 80s in general. But the reason I'm showing Geary on the screen anyway is that it's very interesting that Goitein actually means something quite different by this phrase from what Geary means. And the differences are instructive. So from the introduction to Living with the Dead in the Middle Ages, Patrick Geary writes, in this world, death was omnipresent, not only in the sense that persons of all ages could and did die with appalling frequency and suddenness, but also in the sense that the dead did not cease to be members of the human community. The living continued to owe them certain obligations, the most important that of memorial or remembrance, and they were present among the living through liturgical commemorations and in their physical remains. So in the Geniza context, from what Goitein discusses and from what I've been able to see so far in the documents that I've looked at, it is obviously and not surprisingly also the case that death was omnipresent and people could and did die with appalling frequency and suddenness, but the dead made themselves felt in a very different way. We actually have not a whole lot in the way of remembrance, in the way of liturgy, or in the way of references to physical remains, which is actually quite surprising. We have some memorial lists, but as you can see from this example, they're not all that impressive. It's not a major genre. And we have very few references to people visiting cemeteries or tending tombs in this period, which is actually extremely odd because it's very present in the Islamic literature of the period. Instead, what we get from the Geniza is how Goitein begins this section. Keeping alive the memory, or rather the presence of a beloved, was first achieved by the commotion that his or her departure aroused. And that is very much the dominant theme in this material. So Goitein begins not with memory, but with grief. And that is where I'm going to start and end as well today. What I want to focus especially on is a striking feature of this material that jumped out at me as soon as I started gathering condolence and sort of responses to death letters in the Geniza, which is the way that letters like Natan's move seamlessly from expressions of overwhelming, uncontrollable grief, my mind is numb and my sense is destroyed, and affirmations of the opposite, human control over grief in the face of death. I return to the Creator, may he be exalted, thankful and steadfast. So that's going to be the theme. I'm going to give just a very, very brief sort of historical and historiographical overview first to these people and then to the subject of death in this milieu, just 3 minutes, and then I'm going to get into the subject proper. So who are the people that we see through the Geniza documents? This corpus gives us what is probably the richest and most intimate look at everyday life that we have among ordinary people anywhere in the world during the Middle Ages. Hence the envy that we began with. The people that it shows us were mainly urban Jews. The biggest population lived in Fustat, in this neighborhood, which was actually built around the old Roman fortress of Babylon that had existed before the Islamic city was founded. This is the fortress as it looked in the early 20th century. And the Jews that we hear about there, they're living among Christians. So on this map here, this is the synagogue where the Geniza stuff was retrieved. And all these yellow structures are churches, and this is a mosque. So there's a lot of Jews and Christians in this neighborhood. There's also a Muslim presence. It's not a kind of exclusively Jewish area by any means. The Jews we hear about in this period mainly identify either as Rabbinites, meaning they have loyalty to rabbinic tradition, or as Karaites, meaning that they are explicitly anti-rabbinic, but this too is a medieval outcome of rabbinization. And in terms of their religious culture, I often say they're kind of boring, which makes them interesting to historians. So they're kind of religiously staid people, meaning this isn't a period of high religious fervor or schism. But on the other hand, their status as Jews and certain Jewish practices did order many aspects of their lives. Jews ran many of their everyday transactions through a Jewish court system that operated pretty much in line with normative rabbinic law, at least at a technical level, although Jews also used Islamic courts. And the literate Jews whose letters we have spoke in a comfortably and ubiquitously religious idiom that drew equally from, on the one hand, the Bible and rabbinic literature, and on the other hand, from the Islamically inflected Arabic culture of their day. So that's the people I'm going to be discussing. In terms of historiography, this is really a subject that has been very little written about, not only in the Geniza, but in medieval Egypt, or really the medieval Islamic Near East more broadly. Goitein's remains the only treatment of death in the Geniza. And beyond the Geniza, there is a small library of really wonderful works. So they're very outstanding works, but there's not a lot of them. So I'll just run through. There's this wonderful collection and study of epitaphs, some of them drawn from literary sources that cite epitaphs across the Islamic Near East during the Middle Ages by Werner Diem. There's this absolutely fantastic book called Muhammad's Grave, Death Rites and the Making of Islamic Society by Lior Halevi, which uses narrative sources, literary sources. It's focused on the sort of early Islamic period, but it really has relevance for later periods as well. Finally, there are numerous studies of textiles drawn from tombs in Egypt, both pre-Islam and post-Islam, which give you a sense of burial practices. And there's also quite a lot of literature on tomb visitation in medieval Egypt, including this book by Christopher Taylor. So that's kind of the existing historiography that I am aware of so far. And so what I started to do in order to gather material is I went to the Princeton Geneva Labs website. This is a project that I'm involved with under the direction of Professor Marina Rusto. And I'm showing it to you because I want to give a plug that in the last 5 years, thanks to Professor Rusto, thanks to this wonderful guy named Alan Elbaum, and also thanks to Dr. Amira Shur, the metadata that we have on the website has expanded exponentially. We have thousands and thousands of new document descriptions that allow you to do keyword searches in English. and it doesn't necessarily give you the whole document, let alone the translation. It doesn't necessarily give you a transcription, let alone a translation, but at least alerts you to what's interesting about this document. So where I'm at with this project is that I did things like this. I looked up burial, graves, mourning, et cetera. And I set a whole corpus of several hundred letters, some of which have been published, some of which haven't, and I have started to go through them. And so there's a lot of really fascinating stuff in here, but what I'm going to talk about today is this sort of representation of grief in letters. Okay, so now I'm going to go back to this letter. It is one of dozens of consolation letters and letters about mourning that survived in the Geniza. I'm not including letters that just kind of have a line in there, but letters devoted, more than half the letter is about response to a death. And this letter is completely typical in that it includes 3 distinct themes that show up in almost all of these letters that I have looked at so far. So first, Nathan expresses his obligations to the mourner, how I must hasten and not delay to address you, meaning I'm writing you this letter because I have to. The second theme is grief. My heart cries out for your sorrow. And then the third theme is the control of grief. I recovered myself and returned to the Creator, thankful and steadfast. They don't always appear in this order, but all 3, or at least 2 out of 3, appear in almost everything that I have looked at so far. And what I'm going to do for the first half of the talk is just put this in context of consolation letters in the Near East in general. Surprisingly, as far as I can tell from the Arabic papyrology database, we really have very few Islamic consolation letters comparable to the Geniza ones from this period. But that is certainly an accident of history. And we have many literary references to consolation letters in Arabic literature that make it virtually certain that Muslims and Christians in Egypt in this time period would have been writing such letters as well. So my working hypothesis is that the letters I'm about to show you, even though they're written by Jews and they deploy Jewish idioms and verses, were not unique to Jews. And the one major corpus I have not delved into yet are Arabic epistolary manuals, which do talk about how to write a consolation letter. And that's going to be probably my most important comparandum, but I haven't done that yet. What I have done is sort of establish that the genre of consolation letter is not unique, not only to Jews, but to the medieval period either. Rather, Geniza consolation letters echo a long tradition of consolation letters in Egypt and elsewhere, but I'll focus on Egypt, that stretch back at least to the 2nd century and that ubiquitously feature the same mix of these 3 themes: the obligations to the mourner, grief, and the control of grief. So what I'm going to do now is just run through a few examples, all of which I am drawing from published articles in various fields that have been translated. So this is a Greek condolence letter from 2nd century Egypt. There's an address, there's the expression of grief. I was grieved and I wept over the fortunate one as much as I had wept over this other person, Didymus. Then there's the obligations. And so I did everything that was fitting, and so did all of my people who are then named. And then there's the control of grief. But all the same, one can do nothing in the face of such things. Therefore, comfort one another. Farewell. So this is a non-Christian Greek letter. But then there are many, many letters in which the same theme from slightly later is Christianized. So this is from the 4th century. There's the obligations. I would have wished to rush to you straight from here, but I wasn't able to travel and meet you because it's difficult for us to go up to the city. Implication being I'm writing you this letter instead. Then there's the control of grief. It is necessary to bear the human lot. Therefore, put away the grief of human fault and think that nobody among men is immortal, but only God. That one doesn't have the grief itself, but there are Christian letters that do. Here is a Coptic letter, which is quite interesting in that it doesn't have the control theme. It has the obligations. Above all, I prostrate myself before my dear sister and brother, that is the people receiving the letter, and all our people by name. God knows that my heart was afflicted when I heard that my girl had died. And the editor thinks that or maybe the editor infers this from something, I don't remember, that it's a person who had nursed this young girl who's writing. And this is the only letter that I have come across yet from either late antiquity or the early Islamic period that is lacking the control of grief theme. This is an Arabic letter published by Khalid Yunus from 8th century Egypt. It has the Bismillah and the address, and then what I think is a fragment of the consoler's obligations. So we did something or other when we heard that they had died. Then there's a long Islamicized passage on control of grief. Indeed, we belong to God, and indeed to him we will return, which is the most ubiquitous consoling verse in the Islamic tradition. May God have mercy and forgive upon them and forgive them, and praise be to God. And then there's another reference to the obligations. This one is lacking the grief, which actually the early Islamic ones have less of. Finally, there are medieval Arabic epistolary manuals, which, as I've said, I have not gone through yet, but I am just giving you a little bit of the one sort of study that I was able to find so far that at least cites one of these. And as in the early Islamic material, these are much, much longer, but they talk about the obligation to write the letter. That's sort of a central theme in the manuals. And then the control of grief is the overwhelming theme. So this is just a little snippet from a 9th century work, which is talking about how to write a condolence letter. And in the introduction, it says that the purpose of the letter is actually to help the mourner control their grief. These words aim at soothing the mind, reminding the family of the victim about paradise, the rewards for their good patience, and also mentioning the qualities of the deceased, together with examples from traditions of the prophets and what they would, the prophet and the noble followers, and what they would say on these occasions. Then the model letter, again, begins with this kind of thing. But very interestingly, there's also a reference to the mourner themselves expressing grief. His urgent needs were asked about grief, and they replied, it is constant and increasing. So from what I can tell so far, these medieval epistolary manuals have the same 3 themes as well. And as I said, they're really all over the Geniza ones. Okay, so that's kind of context for this practice of writing condolence letters in terms of other parallels. What I want to talk about now are the 3 themes that I've highlighted. So obviously, none of these ideas are unique to the Geniza or to medieval Egypt. The ideas that mourning provokes social obligation, that death provokes grief, and that grief needs to be controlled are widespread across many, many human cultures. And since I'm speaking to a group of European medievalists, I will note this very lovely book about the restraint of grief in late medieval Italy. However, even though they are very ubiquitous themes, what I want to focus on now is some of the specific valences that these themes would have held in this culture in medieval Egypt, which again had developed very directly against a much older backdrop of Near Eastern ideas and practices. So I'm going to start very briefly with the obligation to write a condolence letter in the first place, which flowed naturally from broader letter writing practices that were common in medieval Egypt and in fact had been common in the Near East since antiquity. In the Geniza context, medieval Arabic and Judeo-Arabic letters represent themselves constantly throughout the whole Geniza corpus as a major symbol of social affiliation and loyalty, just as Greek letters had been before them. And we actually have a very nice article about this, which I will just cite, by Arnold Franklin. And he goes through a lot of examples and sums up the idea that a letter is or should be a substitute for the letter writer, him or herself, was pervasive and had an impact on all registers of epistolary activity. So the idea of writing a consolation letter and also writing a letter about mourning to someone either before or after they write a consolation letter is sort of part of this broader matrix of letter writing that runs through all of our stuff. Since we are talking about Jews and Judeo-Arabic, I also just want to flag this wonderful book by Jonathan Dechter entirely on the theme of praise letters, which are these kind of empty, seemingly pointless letters that we also have both in the Geniza and among medieval Jews, and in fact, Muslims and Christians as well. And it's just sort of highlighting the importance of the letter itself as a social actor, as a kind of gift. Modern readers have sometimes been struck, even puzzled by the amount of panegyric contained within Jewish letter writing. Yet these documents provide us with an intimate glimpse into the inner logic of medieval Jewish culture, for their rhetoric bespeaks some of its most fundamental conceptions of leadership, friendship, and interpersonal connection. So the kind of condolence letters make a lot of sense within this culture. And again, it's not unique to Jews or to the Geniza either, but these are the Geniza examples and the Jewish examples I wanted to talk about. I would now like to move to the control of Greek. So, excuse me, not of Greek, of grief. The control of grief that is urged in this body of letters echoes religious injunctions that appear across Jewish, Christian, and Islamic traditions in the region. And in fact, we can just begin with the book of Job. Job arose and tore his mantle, shaved his head, fell to the ground and prayed. He said, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return there. The Lord gave and the Lord took. May the Lord's name be blessed. Now, of course, in the context of Job, this is the beginning of the book, and then Job doesn't stay so sanguine. But I am showing you this snippet because this part of the book of Job is actually cited a lot in later traditions by all three groups. Separately from the sort of Hebrew biblical tradition, there's also a strong pre-Christian Greco-Roman tradition on this exact same theme, and scholarship about this often cites Plutarch, who wrote this very cheerful letter to his wife after their daughter had died, urging her to control her emotion. Keep me as well as yourself within bounds, for I know it can set a measure to the magnitude of our loss. But if I find any extravagance of distress in you, this will be more, this should say grievous, not previous. This will be more grievous to me than what has happened. So Plutarch himself wasn't a Stoic, but this letter is very often cited to kind of sum up in the context of death what this stream of Greco-Roman tradition looks like. And there is this other figure, Anaxagoras, who is also often cited in this literature, whose son died, and his response was, I knew he was mortal when I fathered him. Okay, so strong pre-Christian traditions on several sides. No, sorry, I skipped the rest of this, but you get the idea. Let's move on to late ancient Christian traditions. Late ancient Christian authors such as Chrysostom did not entirely line up with the Stoic view because they emphasized the therapeutic value of sorrow, although usually in response to sin rather than to loss. But in the context of mourning, control of grief does appear as a prominent theme in sermons. And there's this very lovely book by Maria Dorfler that has been written on theological responses to the death of children in late antiquity. And she cites the 6th century Greek burial hymn, which again has the same theme. Let us not weep beyond measure for those who through death have been separated from their loved ones. With them we shall after a little time be, but let us beseech and entrust the merciful Lord that with them we may be admitted heirs of the everlasting mansions which he has prepared for the just and for the righteous. Okay, moving on to early Islam. Karen Bauer has noted that the root hazana, or grief, appears 42 times in the Quran, and in 39 of these instances, so all but 3 of them, it appears with a negation, meaning don't grieve. As in this surah, whoever truly believes in God and the last day and does good will have their reward with their Lord. There will be no fear for them, nor will they grieve. So sort of control of grief is a major theme in the Quran. And all of this, I sort of went far in order to provide relevant context for what is the single most central idea about grief in medieval Islamic literature, namely the value of sabr, a term that we can translate as steadfastness or endurance or forbearance in the face of loss. Avner Giladi has done pioneering work on this, especially based on literature from the Mamluk period. So I am showing you here 3 different articles that he has written on these themes, which are all really wonderful. And I realize this is not enough time for anyone interested to write these down, but I'll be happy to go back to this slide later if anyone wants to follow up on this. But to just give a sense of this discourse, I'm going to show you 2 of the sources that Giladi cites. One is an early hadith, so from the early Islamic period, a story about this man whose son was ill. The guy leaves the house and the son dies. When Abu Talha returned home, he asked, how does my son fare? And his wife replied, he is quieter than he has ever been. He proceeds to eat supper. They have sex. And then when that's all finished, she says, bury the boy. And this is being cited as very, very praiseworthy behavior, and that she later, from that experience, gives birth to a boy because she was so steadfast. What Giladi shows is that this is a theme in Hadith, but in the context of the Black Death, especially in the Mamluk period, there is an outpouring of consolation treatises aimed at, in Giladi's words, channeling the strong emotional reactions of bereaved parents into legitimate religious modes of mourning, that is, into sabr. And this is a commentary on this early hadith from the 14th century. This woman showed steadfastness, their sabr, accepted, acted deliberately, and prepared for herself a reward for her patience. Therefore, God replaced her lost child with a better one. So just kind of the long afterlife and way in which this theme gets elaborated and systematized. The same exact idea appears in Judeo-Arabic literature among Jews. So this is from a 10th century commentary by actually a Karaite author on this passage in Job. And he uses the same term, sabr, to explain what Job did and why it was good. May the Lord's name be blessed, meaning that God is praiseworthy for the good, and I have nothing but beneficence and praise from him. And if he's taken them, meaning this is Job speaking about his lost children, if he's taken them from me, he's benefited my ability to remain steadfast. Sorry. Okay, so that is a very, very prominent theme in medieval Islamic literature and, in fact, in medieval Judeo-Arabic literature as well, which informs the discussions of sort of steadfastness and acceptance in our letters. The third theme is grief itself, and that is what I'm going to now focus on. To my mind, the most remarkable aspect of Geniza letters is the vivid detail that they offer about the mourner's grief in a way that is not typical of the earlier late ancient and early Islamic letters that we looked at. That is not to say that grief wasn't culturally important in these earlier contexts. Obviously, all of this kind of theme about controlling grief in the pre-Islamic as well as in the early and medieval Islamic period suggests that actually people did mourn the dead very expressively and very openly. But in the Islamic legal context, much of the legal discussion of sabr and of having steadfastness targets ritual grief at funerals, which is associated especially with women, including professional wailing women who are depicted tearing off their clothes, shaving their heads, tangling their hair, scratching and wounding their faces. Again, practices that date back to Antiquity, that medieval Jews, Muslims, and Christians all shared, and that in fact extended beyond the Near East. However, within the Islamic context, all of these sort of very performative, expressive mourning practices are seen as pre-Islamic Arabian practice. There is a genre of very beautiful poetic elegies, this one attributed to a woman in the pre-Islamic period, that kind of you can see as in concert with the ritual practices that I just described. Be generous, my eyes was shedding copious tears. I could not sleep and was awake all night. It was as if my eyes were rubbed with grit. I watched the stars, though it was not my job to watch them, and at times I wrapped myself in my remaining rags. These poems were, this genre of poem was very active in our period as well. Sorry, I was wondering where I put my painting. Okay, this is kind of hard to make out, but the image of the illuminated manuscript that I have put here is from probably the most famous medieval Islamic illuminated manuscript. And it is a depiction, it's probably hard to see on the screen, but you can see women doing some of these things that I just described. Geniza documents make clear that professional wailers were in fact a standard feature of funerals. And I'm just going to give you two examples. This is a mother writing a legal document explaining that she has no money left that she can give on to the heirs because as for what the dead girl left, I didn't spend something on her, but for the burial and wailing. So wailing is very often talked about as one of the expenses of the funeral. And we have this very interesting record of the sale of an enslaved woman who is named the singing woman, the wailer. So not just sort of professional paid wailers, but also enslaved women who are doing this. So one obvious way to think about this, the kind of disjuncture between all the discourse on steadfastness and the performative sort of ritual wailing and elegies is as a kind of dichotomy between practice and ideology. So, popular practices, often those associated with women versus elite male ideas. And that's certainly how the Islamic legal literature talks about female wailers, for example. What is interesting about accounts of grief in Geniza letters is that that is not how they represent the relationship between these two things at all. First of all, grief and control of grief are not rigidly gendered. And also, they're not bifurcated within the letters in a way that sort of suggests the grief then gets resolved by the discourse about controlling it. In fact, from what I can see so far, these letters do not seem to see these two responses as forming a contradiction or a dichotomy altogether. Rather, we get intense accounts of grief alongside discussions of controlling grief in a way that suggests that intense accounts of grief were a central component of epistolary norms for writing about death to begin with, both in mourning letters, in condolence letters, and also in letters from mourners. So this theme of kind of talking at great length about your grief and how uncontrollable it is in the same breath that you're talking about controlling it is kind of a feature, not a bug of this material. And I'm going to go through now one long, very interesting example that actually Goitein translated already, so this is not a new text. This is a letter from a man who apparently was physician to the Ayyubid Sultan in late 12th century Cairo to his father after his brother has died. And I'm just showing you a little snippet of it. As you can see, from the picture, it's a very, very, very long letter, and there's more about his grief in here than I'm even showing you, but this is just a little taste of it. Of all the clothing I had on, nothing remained except my loincloth and turban, which was half on my head and half thrown into the mud. When I came home, I didn't pass a fireplace or oven without putting ashes on my head. My senses were completely lost. He then says that a whole bunch of people from the court, from the Ayyubid court, came and told him to stop it. Finally, Aziz ad-Dawla al-Azizi came and said, "The Sultan has sent us to console you. This is what he wants to tell you. Accept the loss of your brother as I did when my brother died. The beloved one is a treasure deposited with us by God. The owner takes it back. What can you do?" Just after reporting this, he then goes into a whole other long section about how he proceeded to grieve after they left, which I'll just show you the first sentences of. Then my eye disease came back. I screamed from the fire in my heart, that is the grief, and also the pain in my eyes. That's one kind of very high-ranking male example. And now I will show you an example about a less high-ranking woman. This is a letter from a man to probably a relative after his father and grandfather have both died, and he's talking about his mother. So she has just lost both her husband and her father. We've been cut off. No one enters or leaves us. That is a formula for kind of social isolation and often also for poverty or not having resources. As for my mother, she hasn't something or other probably slept from grief and weeping night and day. She has no eye or body left. We're afraid something may happen to her because anywhere there's weeping, meaning anywhere that there's presumably either a funeral or people within a home after there's been a death, she goes there and won't return until she's fainted. We worry about her constantly. I find this passage very interesting because it depicts this woman kind of actively seeking to engage in this kind of very intense grief, not in the sense of ritual wailing, but something sort of halfway between that and spontaneous tears. So these letters and others like them suggest that part of the scripted exchange of what you did in consolation letters or letters that you sent after somebody close to you had died was actually talk about how expressive, public, physical, and intense your grief had been. And these letters do this while consistently alongside these passages invoking the rhetoric of sabr or endurance. This juxtaposition is really unusual. It's different from any earlier corpus of consolation letters that we have from the region. And I think it suggests that both of these opposing responses in the medieval period comprised a single cultural script that was kind of the normative thing that you did in this kind of letter. And that is what I'm hoping to work on as I proceed with this research. That's actually sort of basically where my findings are so far, although I will talk a little bit more than that for a few more minutes. But what I'm interested in doing is kind of continuing to work on this, looking at the epistolary manuals in Arabic and seeing to what extent they have this same phenomenon. I have a lot of inchoate ideas about what is going on here, but I'm going to close by talking about just sort of one stream of thoughts that I have on this. Death introduces a break in the social order and also in people's existential metaphysical orders. Ritual wailing can be seen as an expression of this chaos, which the control of grief tames. So anthropological scholarship and historical scholarship on ritual wailing, including that wonderful book by Lior Halevi that I mentioned earlier, often emphasizes the social economic loss that is incurred by death. And so the kind of gendered women's expressions of death are discussed in that context. So for example, in the early Islamic period, there's a lot of literature that references single women in particular wailing for the men that they had depended on after those men died. And that is definitely present in this letter that I have up on the screen here, right? We've been cut off, no one enters or leaves us, followed by this kind of aggressive pursuit of grief. So I think that that is definitely one strand of explanation. But I also think that in the context of this body of letters, this convention of talking about grief in this way goes beyond this and it goes beyond the economic kind of explanation into these people's basic way of making sense of the world. And I'm going to close with one aspect of it. Scholars who have delved into the social world of the Geniza have overwhelmingly emphasized the intense interconnectedness among people and social reciprocity that runs throughout this body of material at kind of all levels of society. This is part of the background to why letters matter so much in the first place. And a wonderful recent article in Speculum, actually it's no longer forthcoming, it's come out now. Alan Elbaum examined a huge corpus of letters about illness and concluded in the medieval Islamicate world, and he's really talking about the Geniza, people interpreted their illness through the lens of social connectedness. People quite literally fell sick on account of others. Social reciprocity was fundamentally a reciprocity between bodies. So in other words, people in Geniza illness letters constantly talk about how they have fallen ill because of a rupture in their social connection to usually the person they're writing to, or sometimes to a third person. This expression is a kind of extension of a discourse about longing for others who are absent that is absolutely central, really at the heart of letter writing culture in this period. So I see this motif of overwhelming, uncontrollable grief when somebody dies as belonging to this same kind of set of epistolary norms. And in fact, not only that, but it's actually like literally the same, because people often say that they have fallen ill from grief. This is just a passing letter in a very passing sentence in a very interesting letter for other reasons. But the first thing they say after this woman dies, after all that, Sitat, the wife of Rabbi Natan, the sister of Awad, died. Blessed be the true judge. This was the greatest grief. It has wrecked and sickened us. And this is just a kind of random example, but this is very, very common. So the part of the reason I think why the expressions of grief are kind of normative alongside expressions of the control of grief is that they belong to this well-established discourse in letters about connectedness and about longing and about physical illness as a result of longing. And I'm going to close with one especially interesting facet of this in the context of grief, which is that people not only fall ill, but they also talk about losing their sense perception as a result of grief. And the letters that I have already shown you actually have this throughout them. So you may have noticed the guy who is running around in his loincloth in the passage that I showed develops an eye disease. It's quite a common motif in these letters. The idea that weeping can lead to blindness is also not exclusive to this concept, to this context. We have Greek references to it. We have references to it in rabbinic literature, in the Quran, among others. But in the context of this body of letters, I see it as part and parcel of a widespread and fundamental sense of human interdependency that is really just sort of everywhere in the Geniza. And that people seem to have felt perfectly comfortable expressing, performing, sort of almost it was expected to perform it in writing alongside and orthogonal to the ideas about religious submission, control of grief, and acceptance that is also so culturally central in this milieu. And I think I have maybe 2 more minutes. So I will just close with one little coda, which is a very, very interesting document. I started by saying that it's surprising that we don't have a lot about visiting graves in the Geniza, because it is something that would fit in very well with the picture I've just painted, and that in fact we know among Muslims. So this is a kind of question mark for me that I want to pursue. But I do have this one really, really lovely document about physical closeness after death that I'm going to end with. Oh, sorry, I didn't talk about that. I'm just going to skip it. Let me go to this one. Okay, so this is a woman's will. And it opens with a kind of typical formula that the woman is sick and confined to her bed and dying, which actually there's a legal reason for writing that. So she may or may not have been in as pitiable a state as it seems. But in any case, she gives a whole bunch of instructions to the witnesses, including this. She said to us, I've actually deliberately skipped over a bit of it. I'm going to go back to it. I want them to purchase a shroud for me, as I have no shroud that I'm happy with. And then she goes through a whole bunch of very, very expensive textiles that she wants them to use, which we have examples of what these things would have looked like. Muslims should perform the wailing, which is also interesting. But then in the middle of all of that, she says this absolutely phenomenal thing. When the end overtakes me, I should be buried in this building that I'm in now. I will not leave it until someone from my family dies, whether my father or mother or brother, then they may take me out with the one who has died. So I should note that this would seem to fly in the face of rabbinic purity law. If anybody who has the status of a priest would ever go into this house, that there's a corpse buried there. But it's a really remarkable testament to kind of this idea of physical closeness, not only within death, but even after death, that she doesn't want to leave the house until she can go be buried in the cemetery with someone else. So I'm going to stop sharing. I will say I am continuing to work on this material, and there are a lot of questions. This is, as I said, very preliminary, but I thought it would be of more human interest than my legal formulary stuff. And I'd be super interested to hear questions, comments, comparative things that I should be thinking about, et cetera. Thank you so much.